Deep Dive with Mohyu.
Welcome back to Deep Dive with Mohyu. We're diving into something you use every day, but maybe you haven't given much thought to biosafety cabinets. These things are like essential for you as medical lab scientists, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to break down the different types, why each one matters, and those key maintenance tips that keep you safe. For our listeners, you're working with patient samples all the time. So get I. And some of those samples could carry infectious agents. So understanding your BSC is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. It's not just about keeping things clean, it's about containment. You got to think of the air inside the cabinet as a controlled zone, right? And HEPA filters, those high-efficiency particulate air filters, those are the real heroes here. They're so effective, they can trap particles smaller than a human hair even. So these filters get rid of almost all airborne particles, including bacteria and viruses, making sure the air flowing over your work area is clean.
It's incredible how much we rely on those filters.
Yeah.
Makes you realize how important that regular maintenance is, right?
Okay.
But we'll get into that later. When I was first starting out, I used to get biosafety cabinets and laminar flow hoods mixed up. What's the difference, really? And why is that difference so important for someone in a medical lab?
Oh, yeah, that's a really common mix-up. And it is super important to know the difference. See, laminar flow hoods, their main job is to protect your samples from contamination. Imagine you're working with a sensitive cell culture. A laminar flow hood basically bathes that work area in clean, filtered air, which protects your culture from anything nasty in the air. But here's the thing. It doesn't protect you or the environment around you.
So for our listeners, if they were handling a particularly infectious sample from a patient, a laminar flow hood wouldn't be enough protection.
Exactly. That's where those biosafety cabinets come in. They provide a much higher level of protection. They act like a barrier between you and the potentially hazardous stuff. So the air gets pulled into the cabinet. It's HEPA filtered first, then it's directed over the work area, and finally it's either recirculated through another HEPA filter or it's exhausted outside the building. So not only is the air inside clean, but any potentially contaminated air is dealt with safely.
It's definitely reassuring to know, especially when you're dealing with potentially infectious material day in and day out. Now, I know there are different classes of biosafety cabinets, and I'm guessing that's where things get really interesting for our listeners. Can we break down those different classes? Let's start with Class I.
Okay, so Class I cabinets, they're kind of the baseline level. They offer protection for the user and the environment, but not specifically for the sample itself. It's similar to a fume hood, actually. It's great for procedures that might create aerosols, like when you're mixing reagents or centrifuging samples, where the sterility of the sample isn't the most important thing.
So thinking of our listeners, a Class I cabinet might be used, if they need to spin down a blood sample, but they aren't that worried about keeping the sample itself sterile, right?
Exactly. Protection ladder a bit. We get to Class II cabinets. These are the ones you'll see in most medical labs. Because they protect the user, the environment, the sample. They have a very specific airflow pattern, which prevents contamination from both the outside and the inside.
That makes sense. Double the protection, right? In a medical lab where you're handling potentially infectious samples all the time. But I remember seeing different types of Class II cabinets. A1, A2, B1, B2. It gets a little confusing, honestly. How can we tell them apart? And which ones are most likely to be found in a medical lab?
Yeah, you're right. There are a few different versions within Class II, and it can be a bit overwhelming, I know. Let's start with the ones you're most likely to use. Types A1 and A2. Both of them offer excellent protection for your work as a medical lab scientist. The difference is how much air they recirculate back into the lab versus how much they vent outside. Type A1 recirculates some of the air back into the lab, while Type A2 can be set up to either recirculate or vent all the air out, depending on the specific setup.
So if our listener is working with something really volatile, something you wouldn't want to risk sending back into the lab, a Type A2 cabinet would be the way to go.
You got it. And that brings us to types B1 and B2, which are designed for working with volatile chemicals. Think about a situation where you're preparing a staining solution with, strong fumes. Type B1 recirculates a little bit of the air, but most of it is vented outside. Type B2, on the other hand, vents all the air out, which makes it the safest choice for handling anything that produces hazardous vapors.
That makes sense. Now, we haven't really talked about Type C1. What's special about this type, and would our listeners see it in a medical lab?
Type C1 is kind of like the Swiss Army knife of Class II cabinets, It's designed to be flexible. It can switch between recirculating and fully exhausting the air, depending on what you're doing. So it can be super useful in a medical lab where you might be handling all sorts of samples and need to adjust the cabinet settings. It also has a backup system, too. If the exhaust system fails, a Type C1 cabinet can run for a while in recirculating mode, which gives you time to safely stop what you're doing and get that issue fixed.
That's a really smart feature, honestly, especially in a setting where safety is so important. Okay, we've covered Class 1 and Class 2 cabinets, but there's one more class. While it's not as common in a typical medical lab, it's still worth mentioning. Class 3?
Ah, yes. Class 3 cabinets. These are the big guns, the maximum containment units. Remember those glove boxes you see in the movies for handling super dangerous stuff? That's essentially what a Class 3 cabinet is. They're completely sealed.
Yes.
The only way to work inside is through those attached gloves. All the air is HEPA filtered multiple times, both when it enters and leaves the cabinet. We're talking about the absolute highest level of protection here, reserved for working with the most dangerous pathogens, like certain highly contagious viruses.
That sounds pretty intense. It's good to know those kinds of safeguards exist. But thankfully, for most medical lab work, those Class I and II cabinets will give you the right level of protection. We've talked a lot about the different classes of cabinets common, but I'm curious about those moments when things go wrong. What are some signs that a biosafety cabinet might not be working correctly?
That's a really important question. It just shows how important it is to stay alert in the lab. One obvious sign is any weird noises, like a rattling fan or a change in the airflow sound, just like with your car. If you hear a strange noise, you know something's up, right? Another red flag is if the airflow feels weaker. You should be able to feel that gentle pull of air into the cabinet. If it feels weak or it's not consistent, that's a sign to stop and figure out what's going on.
So being aware of how the cabinet normally sounds and feels is really important. It's like knowing your own body, you can tell when something's not right. Are there any other, maybe less obvious clues we should be looking for?
Definitely. Keep an eye out for condensation building up inside the cabinet. That could mean there's a problem with the seals or with humidity control. And always, always check those HEPA filters visually. If you see any rips, tears, or any discoloration, you need to get that filter replaced.
Those are all great tips. It's clear that knowing how your cabinet normally operates and being able to spot any changes is key to catching problems early on. Now let's talk about maintenance. How do we make sure these cabinets keep protecting us day after day? I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear about the best practices to keep in mind.
You're right. Maintenance is crucial. It's like keeping your lab coat clean. It's not just about how it looks. It's about preventing contamination. Even before you start working in the cabinet, take a moment to just look it over. Check for any obvious signs of damage, like cracks in the sash or loose fittings, things like that.
Kind of like doing a pre-flight check on a plane.
Yeah, exactly. Now, when you're setting up your workspace inside the cabinet, be smart about it. Don't clutter things up because that can mess with the airflow. Remember those airflow patterns we talked about? Those are crucial for containment. Even stacking things too high can create a dead zone where the air isn't circulating properly.
So it's not just about having a clean cabinet, it's about having an organized one. It's like that cooking principle, mise en place, everything in its place. Makes things go smoother and safer.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, once you're done working in the cabinet, it's time for cleanup. This is a step that a lot of people rush through, but it's really, really important. First, you got to get everything out of there, all materials and equipment. Then, wipe down every surface thoroughly with the right disinfectant. Pay attention to those tricky spots, like the corners, under the work surface, things like that.
Sounds like attention to detail is key here. I imagine a medical lab setting has stricter rules for cleaning and disinfecting than a general research lab, right? What kinds of disinfectants are typically used in a medical lab?
You're right. The exact disinfectants will vary, depending on the types of organisms you're working with. Your lab should have specific protocols in place. But common ones include solutions with bleach, ethanol, or quaternary ammonium compounds. The main thing is to use a disinfectant that works against the specific pathogens you might be dealing with.
Makes sense. Now, what about those HEPA filters? We've talked about how crucial they are, but how often should they be replaced?
HEPA filters are kind of like the air filters in your car. They need to be replaced regularly for them to do their job properly. The exact replacement schedule depends on the type of cabinet you have, how often you use it, and what kinds of materials you're working with, but a good rule of thumb is to replace them at least once a year.
So it's not something you want to forget about. Probably a good idea to have a reminder system in place, to make sure those filters get changed on time.
Absolutely. And don't forget about that pre-filter. It's located before the HEPA filter, and it helps to catch those bigger particles, which actually extends the life of the HEPA filter. That pre-filter needs to be replaced more often, usually every few months or so.
Right, good point. Kind of like changing the oil filter in your car, right? It's a smaller, less expensive part,
Yeah.
but changing it regularly helps protect the more important parts.
Exactly. Now, beyond the cleaning and filter replacement, there are a few other maintenance things to remember. The UV lamp, if your cabinet has one, should be replaced every year. And the blower motor, the thing that drives the airflow, that should be inspected and serviced regularly too.
So it sounds like maintaining a biosafety cabinet is an ongoing process, not just a one-time thing. It's all about being proactive.
Yeah.
And paying attention to the small stuff, because those small things can make a big difference in safety.
Exactly. Regular maintenance is really an investment in safety. It makes sure that your cabinet continues to do its job, providing that critical barrier between you and potential hazards. And speaking of safety, there are a couple of other important points to keep in mind. Always wear the right personal protective equipment, like gloves and a lab coat when you're working in the cabinet. Try to keep the sash closed as much as you can so you don't disrupt the airflow. And never, ever eat, drink, or store food inside the cabinet.
All excellent reminders. It's easy to get complacent, when you're in a familiar environment, but following the proper procedures is so important for safety, especially in a medical lab setting.
You're absolutely right. Complacency can be dangerous. Now, before we move on, Haya, I want to emphasize how important documentation is. You need to keep good records of all your maintenance activities, like your cleaning logs, filter replacement dates, service records, all of that. This documentation not only helps you track the cabinet's history, but it also shows that proper maintenance procedures are being followed.
That's a great point. Documentation is often overlooked.
Yeah.
But it's crucial for accountability and for making sure everyone is following the same safety procedures. It's kind of like a ship's logbook. It helps you keep track of the journey and make sure everything is running smoothly.
Exactly. Now, I know we've been focusing on the practical maintenance tips, but there's another aspect of biosafety cabinet upkeep that people often forget about. Certification.
Certification.
Yeah.
What does that involve? And why is it so important?
So, biosafety cabinets need to be professionally certified every year to make sure they're working within the required safety standards. This certification involves a bunch of tests like measuring the airflow velocity, testing the HEPA filter integrity, to confirm that the cabinet is doing what it's supposed to do, providing that level of protection.
So it's like getting your car inspected to make sure it's safe to drive. You might think everything's fine, but a professional inspection can find those hidden problems. They could be dangerous.
Exactly. Certification is a critical step in making sure your biosafety cabinet is safe and reliable. It gives you that peace of mind, knowing that your cabinet has been thoroughly checked. And it meets all those important safety standards.
This has been such a great discussion on biosafety cabinet maintenance. It's obvious now that it's not just about keeping things clean. It's about really understanding how the system works and being proactive to make sure it's working properly. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious about the future of biosafety cabinets. What are some of the new trends or innovations that are shaping this field and making these cabinets even safer and more efficient?
That's a great question. The world of biosafety is constantly changing, and we're seeing some really exciting advancements in biosafety cabinet technology. One trend that I find particularly interesting is smart technology. Imagine a cabinet that can, monitor its own performance and alert you to any potential issues, even before they become big problems.
Whoa, that sounds pretty futuristic. What kind of smart features are we talking about?
Well, we're starting to see cabinets with sensors that can track the airflow velocity super accurately. These sensors can pick up on even tiny fluctuations in airflow, which could indicate a leak or a blockage. Some cabinets even have sensors that monitor the HEPA filters, giving you real-time feedback on how well they're working.
That's amazing. It's like having a built-in safety net that's constantly checking the cabinet's vital signs.
Exactly. This real-time monitoring is a game changer for lab safety, seriously. It allows for proactive maintenance, so you can prevent small issues from turning into big problems.
It sounds like these smart cabinets are taking a lot of the guesswork out of maintenance. Are there any other trends on the horizon that you're excited about?
Another area where there's a lot of innovation happening is ergonomics. Traditionally, working in a biosafety cabinet for a long time could be tiring, but newer designs are incorporating features that prioritize user comfort, like adjustable height work surfaces, angled sashes for better visibility, and even armrests to reduce fatigue.
That's great. After all, if the cabinet is uncomfortable to use, people might be tempted to cut corners or rush through procedures, which could compromise safety. Making the cabinets more user-friendly means people are more likely to use them correctly, and that ultimately makes things safer.
Absolutely. And, we can't forget about sustainability either. New cabinet designs are incorporating energy-efficient motors, optimized airflow patterns, and even smart features that can adjust the cabinet's operating mode based on how it's being used. All of this is aimed at reducing energy consumption without sacrificing performance.
So it's not just about safety, it's about being environmentally responsible as well. These advancements are really impressive. It's exciting to see how technology is making labs safer and more sustainable. But for our listeners out there who are probably working with cabinets that might not have all the bells and whistles of these newer models, what's the one key takeaway message they should remember?
Even without all the fancy technology, the basics of biosafety, cabinet safety haven't changed. Understanding how your cabinet works, being diligent about maintenance, on back-bat procedures, and following the right procedures. Those are the most important things for operating safely and effectively.
That's a great point. Technology can definitely make things safer, but it doesn't replace the need for good practices and a strong safety culture. It's been a really fascinating look at biosafety cabinets. I feel like I've learned so much, honestly. So for our listeners out there who are now basically biosafety cabinet experts, what's one thing they can do today to be even safer when using their BSC?
I'd say take a few minutes and review your lab's standard operating procedures for biosafety cabinets. It's easy to slip into routines. What do you ever do? A quick refresher can help you get back into those good habits and make sure you're using the cabinet safely and effectively.
That's great advice. Like brushing up on your driving skills, right? A little refresher can go a long way in preventing accidents. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of Deep Dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring the world of biosafety cabinets.
It was great diving deep into this topic with you. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep those cabinets clean.